Hey everybody, this is Jared Marlowe with the Blue and Gray Education Society, and we have a real special guest on tonight, a great friend of the Blue and Gray Education Society, historian, author, and now recently retired, Mr. Gary Ecelbarger. How are things, Gary?
Everything's great, Jared. Thanks for having me on tonight.
Yeah, well, we're certainly glad to have you. I know many of you have heard of Gary through his Civil War studies before. Of course, he's written probably the best book out there on the First Battle of Kernstown, um, and then other books about the Shenandoah Valley and Battle of Atlanta. But we're not going to focus on that tonight because Gary has a new book out called George Washington's Momentous Year, Volume 1, from July, or this volume goes from July to the December of 1777. But before we talk about this book, what got your interest sparked in the American Revolution? Because I find when doing historical studies, people either fall into Civil War camps or American Revolution camps, and there may be some connection between them, but they're typically devoted to one or the other. So what got you involved in the American Revolution?
And I've always been in both camps. Just in writing, it was Civil War first. The it went back to my family tree. The very first book I wrote was called An American Family. It was a self-published gift, a Christmas gift in 1992 for my parents and my brothers and sisters and grandparents at the time they were still alive. And it took my family from the Revolution to the birth of my grandparents. And back then, I realized I think at that time, I thought I had 9 direct ancestors that served in the Revolution, including this is kind of rare, a grandfather, a son, and a grandson that of the same family line that were in it.
Oh,
Two of
wow.
them were in the same regiment. So it was all very interesting to me. Since then, I found out even more direct ancestors that served. So I think I'm at 11. Most of them militia, but to me that didn't matter. Continentals,
Right,
militia, didn't matter.
right.
So that's where my interest first started. I started running tours of the Revolutionary War. I think my first tour was of the Brandywine battle and part of the Philadelphia campaign back in 2005. And sporadically, I ran those all the way to COVID. The last 2 I did was for Begis in 2017 and 2018. And a lot of my book ideas kind of spring from things I think about or talk with other people during my tours, and this is no exception. To be honest, the concept of this has been brewing for quite a while. So I'm glad I've found a unique way to present at least a part of the history of the Revolutionary War. And as you showed
So,
with that book, I was going to say, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but that's one you should be able to judge by its cover. That's a darn good cover, isn't
I agree, and we'll put it up here so everybody can
Yeah, I
see
always
it
tell people
again.
that's a Rembrandt Peale image of George Washington. Charles Wilson Peale was a noted period portraitist of the Revolution, and he named all of his kids after famous artists. And one of his kids was named Rembrandt Peale, and he actually drew or sketched Washington from life very late in Washington's life. And then that painting from which that cover's derived, I think he created in the late 1820s. But it's a neat image. I'd love to have been able to use that for the cover.
Yeah, definitely, and it's not one that you often see when it comes to
No,
Washington.
no,
Because if you think Washington portraits, my first thought is the one that's right there behind you.
oh
That's the
yeah,
way.
the Gilbert Stewart one, yeah. And the
Right,
problem is, and we saw, um, I did a lot of tours back then, and still do a lot of tours with Scott Passion. We always laugh because in the Brandywine Park at the time, they had an image of George Washington. It's always that guy, Dollar Bill George,
right,
either the powdered hair or the old George. And George was vibrant, 45-year-old general at this period, kind of more of a reddish brown hair at the time. So I'm at least we want to depict him the way he actually looked at the in the period. So although that cover image doesn't show it, the images I show inside the book are more realistic to the period.
right. So You kind of touched on it, but I want to dive a bit deeper into it.
Sure.
Especially as we're approaching America's 250th anniversary, and there's going to be a very much renewed interest in the story of the birth of America. And with George Washington being the most written about American in history, what motivated you to say, okay, I'm going to take a look at this 1 year of his life? What prompted you to say, okay, I'm going to take it just this one little piece out?
Well, I would argue that probably Lincoln still has more on him than George does, but it might be very close. And I don't shy away from that because I wrote a book on Abraham Lincoln too. So I always look for that new story. I think there were 17,000 books and monographs on Lincoln at the time I wrote about Lincoln. And maybe you're right. Maybe George does have more written about him since he was there earlier. Um, well, there are a couple things that got me interested in George Washington first, and I dedicated this to my late father. He was always a huge Washington fan, and always was trying to get me to do a book on Washington, and I wasn't ready to transfer from Civil War history to Revolutionary War. You had to get on a learning curve to feel comfortable enough to write
Mhm.
about it, even though I'd always done a lot of tours and things. So I always told him it was going to be in the future, and I'm glad I'm glad I finally got to it. But as far as the main character, using George Washington as a base, I find in um, uh, in Revolutionary War literature that there's a lot of campaign anthologies out about the Philadelphia campaign and about Valley Forge and a few about the New Jersey and Monmouth campaign, of which that year we've talked about covers all those things. And they're broad campaign perspectives, and a lot of them are excellent. In fact, from the first tour I ran in 2005, there were at least three great books on the Philadelphia campaign that came out after that, which changed the whole tour that I used to run. So I feel bad for those that went on my tour in 2005. It's a different story. All right. But none of them followed that came from the perspective of headquarters. And I always thought that would be the best way to look at a campaign is what did the architect of the campaign know? When did he know it? What did he do about it? And I was toying with this idea first with a civil war because I was more comfortable writing about it at that time. I remember I was kind of thinking about doing it with Sherman in the Atlanta campaign, for example. Um, but as I started, then I did a couple of a series of two tours for Len and Begis, and on the basically covering the period that I just did from a broader perspective. And I talked it over with my tour group at that time, and we kind of milked this idea. And I finally made that decision um, right before COVID hit in 2020. I'm going to do this on George Washington, and what a great vehicle to use because the only book that would come even close to comparing to the model that I'm created of looking at it from the perspective of him in a campaign structure would be one of the volumes of Douglas Southall Freeman's 7 volumes on George Washington, which is a biography. But a few of those volumes are immersed in the Revolutionary War, so it's looking at a biography of George at that time, and it's like volume 4 and part of volume 5. So what I really call this is a military campaign biography of George Washington and his headquarters, because you got to get the personality of headquarters, and when you have people like Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence and all these others involved with the headquarters, and they write so much, it makes it that much more of an interesting story. So, and what I found when I took it from that perspective is that I look at the campaign, I think accurately, but from a whole different perspective. And I talk to people that have written these campaign histories when I come up with my new findings, and they're actually surprised because they don't, and I don't expect them to. They didn't consider it from that perspective. Like, how long did it take the dispatch to reach him before he made that decision? It's those things that for somebody that writes about Civil War campaigns, um, that would bog you down to be really, really heavily focused just on that arena. So that's what the avenue that I took allows me to do is focus strictly on the headquarters. And then your next question was, why did I choose July 4th to July 4th? Oh, well,
Right.
that's the gem of it because, um, as you mentioned, the first anniversary of celebrating the independence of our country, which was actually verbally approved in Congress on July 2nd, um, could have been on July 2nd, 1777, or July 4th, and it ended up being a last minute decision for cities like Philadelphia to even have a celebration. So to have a celebration in the midst of a war was kind of interesting. And what I found, and you read this in the opening chapter, is that all the great cities in the 13 new states of the United States of America were having these grand celebrations. I mean, heck, in Charleston, I think they fired a 76 gun salute out of Fort Moultrie, and then had a 13 gun, out of cannons, and then just had the militia companies fire another 13 round salute and toast each one. So they had some major celebrations in a lot of the big cities in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Albany, in Philadelphia, of course. So I think I found them in just about every state but Georgia, because I didn't have a Georgia newspaper to confirm that, but I'm sure they celebrated it in Georgia as well. So it was interesting. While that's all going on, in Morristown, New Jersey, where Washington had encamped his Continental Army, he doesn't he doesn't mention it. He doesn't celebrate it. He doesn't mention it. There's no writings from the staff that even acknowledge that it's the first anniversary of the birth of the country. And I found that incredibly striking, because even in 1776, when he was in New York and had learned that the Declaration had passed and was ratified and was currently being signed, I think he gave his men a gill of rum. I mean, he acknowledged it and had that kind of a muted celebration, so to speak. But in 77, didn't recognize it at all. Now let's flash forward to 1778. Not only does he celebrate, okay, and still we're 5 years from the end of the war, he has the first grand military pageant parade in the history of this country, with nearly 18 to 19,000 troops on the Raritan River, basically where Rutgers University campus is today, celebrating it with feu de joie, with the firing down the line, and a celebration with cannons going off that the British Army that was about to launch from Sandy Hook to the safety of New York could hear several miles away. So what got me interested in that is what happened in that year between July 4th, 77 and July 4th, 1778, that made Washington not only want to recognize it, but celebrate it the way that he did. And that's what this whole 2-volume work is about.
One more question for you, and this one just popped in my head before we start talking about the details of the book
Sure.
itself. Is there any difference when you approach a Civil War topic as opposed to an American Revolution topic? Like, is there any like different mindset or different writing style or approach that you have to take with one or the other?
There is, because I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm still writing Civil War history as well. And one of my future Civil War books will be on the final 3 weeks of the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1862. And I was kind of amused. I was giving a tour for Begis in June on Port Republic, and I pulled out a file of just one regiment, and I had 32 contemporary accounts of that regiment's action in the Battle of Port Republic. And you'd be hard pressed in many cases to find 32 accounts of an entire battle in the Revolution that were contemporary, written, near the time that the battle was fought. You'll come up with a few memoirs. A lot of people like to use the pension accounts as well. But in other words, from the soldier perspective, you're going to be stuck with a lot of open-ended questions you're not going to be able to answer. So I'm glad I don't do Civil War, or excuse me, Revolutionary War battle histories, because it would be very frustrating to me, who's been well ensconced in writing several Civil War battle books, to be having those big gaps that I'm not going to be able to answer, because I like to approach my topics by asking questions that a lot of these questions had never been asked before, and I always think should be asked, you know. And then my job is to try to answer those questions. A lot of times I can, and sometimes I can't. So when I approach it from this other perspective of headquarters, the questions still pop up. I'm surprised that the questions never get asked, and in a lot of cases, I am able to answer them. So from a headquarters perspective, since I brought up Sherman in the Atlanta campaign and George Washington in the Philadelphia campaign, I find that there's more voluminous writings from headquarters perspective in the Revolutionary War than there is sometimes with Sherman's staff that I can find. So I'm blessed there because at least I have the material to analyze to put the story together. So that's the biggest difference.
Right. Yeah,
And
that
of course, the other thing is, and it makes you might think it makes things easier. I mean, there's no railroad and there's no telegraph in the
right,
Revolution, so it's
right,
the old primitive method that had been used for centuries of getting information across, and it's a written document carried by a courier on a horse, and that was no different in 1770s, and it's still used in the 1800s, of course, but that was used for centuries prior to the 1700s. So
right. Well, let's dive into it. And you've already talked about it. So, chapter one opens up July 4th, 1777. The United States has officially been an independent country for 1 year. You know, it isn't a great time in America by any stretch, but you know they're still kicking after 1 year. And what you would think would be a great grand celebration, and momentous day for Washington isn't. So
right.
or can you tell us more about just the
Yeah,
that story?
it's kind of interesting because Washington is angst driven at this stage because he's trying to find out what his main adversary, who's in New York, and that's William Howe, the commander in chief of the Crown forces in North America, where he's planning to go. They can hear him building his ships. He's going to transfer his troops by some great armada somewhere, and they don't know if he's going to go to try to suppress the Albany region, which is still held by the Americans, and support a wing of the British Army that's transferring down from Canada under Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, or if he's going to threaten Philadelphia by way of sea. And the thought would be that he would come right up through the capes of the Delaware and up the Delaware River, and Washington has to commit because he's moving by land and he's got to beat the landing of the ships, or at least get his troops in a good position. So I think he's a little overwhelmed by that, trying to make that decision, and the intelligence they're receiving isn't helping them out so much, and they have to contend with the fact that British invasion from Canada, no, not the Beatles, not that British invasion, but the British invasion coming down from Canada is threatening the American held Fort Ticonderoga, which is going to fall on July 6th, and that's going to drive Washington even a bit battier about all this. So that's why he's so consumed with it and not in any mood to celebrate, even though just 60 miles away from him, Philadelphia is having this fantastic 4th of July celebration. But in Washington's case, you have to realize too, I mean, the dedication of him is that, remember, he committed to leading this upstart American army against an elite world force. It's not the best army in the world. I mean, I think the Prussians would hold that honor, but
Mhm.
it's a highly trained European army. And here is Washington in 1775, wearing his uniform to the Second Continental Congress, basically saying, I want to lead this group a year before they even declare independence. So this great landowner in America has really gone for broke with this, because obviously if this revolution fails, he's going to be strung up and he's going to lose all of his holdings, and his all of his relatives are gonna suffer for that as well. So Washington sacrificed a lot. And I think I even brought this up in the book, for people that are still working their day job. You'll see people call out for a day sick, their mental health day. Well, Washington will go years and years and years without taking a day off. he rarely is sick, never injured in the war. And here I'm writing him about him 2 years into the war, and he's writing and active in headquarters every single day, no weekends off for him. So he is 100% committed to this, and working his campaign in July of 1777 as a reaction to where his adversary is going to go.
Right. And how does it end up moving? And he lands in August of 77,
Right.
correct?
That's
And
correct.
Is it Head of Elk, Maryland?
Right,
Or
right. It's called
or-
Elkton. It's called Elkton today. It's Head of Elk at the time. Um, and I've actually found the exact spot where the British landed, which is kind of cool. I get to take tour groups out there. Um, but it wasn't their initial intent. I mean, Howe did want to go right up the Delaware. I mean, he had it approved. Remember, when the British commander has to get approval through the Secretary of State and the hierarchy, it has to travel. His requests have to travel 3,000 ocean miles to get approved and then come back to him. So you're talking about months long delay before he actually embarks on his mission. So he had planned this armada by sea, which ends up being over 260 transports, to carry this large army of his, as early as he's planning the invasion of Philadelphia as early as December, but by sea as early as April. And he launches in July and plans to go up the Capes of the Delaware, but gets misinformed about the strength of the American defenses just around Philadelphia on the Delaware River, which weren't nearly as strong as how was led to that they were. And instead, he pulls out to sea again and then goes up the next mouth that will bring him in closer to Philadelphia, and that's the Chesapeake. So he ascends the Chesapeake as high as the waters will allow him, which is the Elk River at the Maryland Delaware border, essentially, which puts him about 55 miles from the capital of Philadelphia when he disembarks on August 25th.
Right. So shortly thereafter, we have another interesting character enter the story with Lafayette. So how does
Right.
Lafayette get involved in
Yeah.
this?
Well, Lafayette's one of these many uh, foreign officers, and most of them are coming to America for a little bit of experience, to get a good rank to use as their eclat to return to their native country and basically lobby that experience and that rank for a good position in the French army. And Lafayette's not the only one that's done this. Um, but he comes as a 19-year-old. He's still a teenager. He'll turn 20 right before the first big battle of this campaign. But he comes as a 19-year-old, and Washington meets him um, on the night of July 31st, when Washington and his whole retinue of aides, and led by a couple of hundred cavalrymen, um, uh, thunder into Philadelphia from crossing the Delaware back from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, and they go to this very well established watering hole called City Tavern, still standing today and open for viewing, right in the historic Philadelphia today. And Washington has a late dinner with his staff, and that's where Lafayette meets him for the first time. And Washington, I think the Lafayette story, when you read Lafayette biographers, I think they misrepresent it a little bit to say that Washington immediately thought of Lafayette as treated him like the son that he never had, and puts him under his wing. It's not that smooth of a story. In fact, the real story's, to me, a lot more interesting, and that is that Washington had a bit of a falling out with Lafayette within weeks of their first meeting, because Washington was put under the impression, just of the typical French general story that I told you, that Lafayette wants to have a staff rank, and he will be made major general, almost like a commission in the Civil War. It's called an appointment, approved by the Continental Congress. So to this day, at the age of 19, the Marquis de Lafayette is the youngest major general in United States history. Still the youngest major general. Uh, but Lafayette gets that bug, that ambition bug, and he wants to have a field position, which he never talked to Washington about. And he's lobbying through through Continental Congress for that. And Washington's quite upset when he hears about it, and he's basically considering Lafayette a bit of a thorn in his side over this issue. Then, when the first major land battle of the Philadelphia campaign is fought, there's a smaller one in Delaware called Cooch's Bridge, but the first major one in which Washington is leading, it's called the Battle of Brandywine. Lafayette, who is a very zealous and enthusiastic and really devoted to the cause, will try to rally some troops on a hill that are being routed on Birmingham Hill, and he'll take a lower wound, a bullet wound to his lower leg, which it's essentially a flesh wound. He's going to recover from it, and everybody's aware of that from the start. They don't think he's going to suffer an amputation or die from it, but they know he's going to need to convalesce. When he comes back to the army, and the book talks about this in the later chapters when he does return, Washington does really warm to him because this guy has sacrificed for the cause. And you could see that bond with Washington start to strengthen. And it'll be Washington that pushes for him to get a field position in his army when he was resistant to it before. He's really pushing for it and succeeds in doing that late in the fall of 1777. And as I'm writing volume 2, I think their bond strengthens even further when they're encamped at Valley Forge together for 6 months. So in other words, what changes from the typical biographer story of Lafayette, and I don't mean to be derogatory about saying typical, but I mean the same template of making Washington instantly fall in love with Lafayette. I think the story is a lot more nuanced than that, and it's a lot more interesting that Washington had initially a falling out with Lafayette and then warmed to him. I think that's the more accurate story and the more interesting one.
Right. I agree. Yeah, that's one that is never told in the books because growing up you always hear, like you said, it's a son he never had,
Right,
and
right.
he takes him under his wing and he molds
And
him from the
and
very get-go.
it's kind of a silly concept when you really, really think about it. And I think we just have to kind of sometimes people are able to they have to kind of get a dose of reality on it. Why would Washington think that for somebody he only knew for 4 weeks?
Right.
I mean, it's just
Right.
especially somebody. I mean, Lafayette, to his credit, I mean, he was a didact. He taught himself English on his 6-week voyage to the U.S. So at least he could speak some broken English and didn't need to have translators all the time. Not that Washington didn't have them. Hamilton was a translator. Lawrence was a translator. Because he'll get other French-speaking generals that Washington will need the translator. So Washington could communicate with Lafayette. Lafayette didn't know enough broken English to do that. But to take the story a little further, it's not in the book, but when Lafayette's so dedicated to the cause, he'll name his first son Georges Washington Lafayette. Okay, you like that? And then he names his first daughter Virginie for Virginia. And I think, and I'm butchering this quote, but Benjamin Franklin writes to Lafayette and he says, "May you have 12 more children," because then they can name all the So Lafayette definitely was extremely dedicated to the cause, as we
Yeah.
like to call that they could like to call the revolution the cause, and I put that in capitals throughout the
Right.
book. Yeah.
So Brandywine happens, the Americans lose. What comes next?
Yeah, the Brandywine's an interesting turning point, and if you allow me to kind of weave into this, I didn't expect to have to do this. I didn't go into the Washington book with this notion that I'm going to have an agenda to what I thought have to quote restore Washington's reputation. But I'm finding now in the aftermath that's kind of what's happening, and I'm thinking, why did Washington need to have a reputation restored? But the impression I had of Washington, that I will admit, I believed enough to repeat the source material in my tours, and I bet you heard this too, Jared, is that that he had followed a Fabian strategy. to a war of avoidance because he knew that he could never defeat the British with an untrained army, right? You've heard that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And the second one is that here's the indispensable man who managed to be the most important person to win the revolution, but he wasn't a very good field commander and he lost most of his battles. You might have
Right.
heard that one too,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yes,
And
sir.
the truth is, when I start that book on July 4th, Washington had all the reason, or his troops had all the reason to celebrate. Because, as I said, this guy that committed his devotion to the cause um, actually had a winning record going into the Philadelphia campaign on battles in which he was personally in charge on the battlefield. He had a 4-2 record. Okay, victories versus losses with what, an untrained army.
Mhm.
So, and he had just won a long forage war, which was a series of 86 contests for garnering supplies in the New Jersey theater, in which mostly his militia did a really nice job throughout, supported by some Continentals. But Howe loses another 900 men in those in that period of time, and for Howe to have to replace his men, they got to cross 3,000 miles of ocean. So it's a big deal when those kind of losses occur, counting what happened in Trenton and Princeton in 76, which is a whole different story, of course. So in other words, Washington enters the Philadelphia campaign not as the loser that people want to think of him as. He's highly regarded both in Europe and in America at this stage. So yes, he loses the Battle of Brandywine, and it really wasn't a battle of him not reading intelligence poorly or getting a lot of misinformation. It was almost a no-win situation. He was defending a river-sized creek that could be crossed in way too many places that it was impossible for him to defend. So it was almost inevitable that Howe was going to get his army across and battle him. And Washington's army lacked the training to be able to deploy quick enough to meet Howe on the contested hill, and it was a domino effect that rolled him up. But that was not a Fabian style battle. In other words, named after the BC Roman general who, with an understrength army, fought what they call a war of posts, where he would lightly defend an area, inflict casualties, and move away from it.
Mhm.
Washington stood at the Brandywine for a full day battle with 17,000 men deployed, right? And Howe attacked him with roughly 16,000 men that were deployed. In other words, this is a huge battle. Um, this battle is larger in numbers of troops engaged than every single battle of Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Valley campaign. All right,
Right.
put some perspective on that. Won't match with the 64 battle, but in 1862 contests in some areas it certainly does. So it's a huge battle, and Washington does lose that battle. And what's really interesting is that his infantry is literally his Continental infantry is literally decimated. 1,300 losses out of 13,000 infantry of that 17,000 man army. There's militia and artillery and dragoons as well. So you would think if with a devastating loss like that you're just going to take your time and lick your wounds and refit and reorganize. But I think Washington already had decided when he left that battlefield is my days as a defensive tactician are over. And when he crosses his army to the safe side of the Schuylkill River, it's got a very weird spelling, but it's pronounced Schuylkill, like school where you take your classes in Kill, Schuylkill River. Um, where the puts a river between him and the British Army. It appears that he was going to stay there and protect Philadelphia from the Philadelphia side of the river. But the very next day, he recrosses the river. And one of the questions I asked myself for 20 years, and nobody ever asked that question, it takes a lot of energy to cross a river with 14,000 men. Why in the world would you cross a river in one direction only to recross it again the very next day? It's crazy talk, right? But they did it. And the reason they did it is Washington holds a council of war, which I got a very little information on, but enough of it to be very convincing. And he basically was testing the pulse of his subordinate generals like Nathaniel Greene and others, and almost to a man, I suppose, they were all in for taking it to Howe, going back across the river and trying to find Howe and to attack him. And the key is, for every time he mentions it, when he crosses that river, and I think I'm the first that really brings this out, Washington always stresses that he is there to attack Howe wherever he can find him on the ground of his choosing. So he is no longer looking at fighting a battle on the defensive. He wants to attack his opponent. And I consider that counsel at Germantown when he was in camp there the prelude to the Battle of Germantown, which will occur several weeks later. Ironic that it'll end up being at the same town that he evacuated just a few weeks earlier. But that was his mindset, not just for the rest of that mini part of the campaign, but for the next few months afterwards, and then for the next 6 months after that. He's always looking for a way to attack his opponent, which goes 180 degrees against the Fabian notion of George Washington that's parlayed by the early 20. This is all a 21st century invention. I mean, it's true, the contemporaries called him our American Fabius, but Washington never acted that way after March of 1777. And the reason why he acted that way in the early spring of 1777 is he only had 3,000 men. So, of course, he's not going to be attacking an army 5 times larger than him when he doesn't have a force. So
Right.
the point is, yes, when he's got an army that outnumbers his opponent, why would you do a Fabian? Why would you have a Fabian strategy or engage in Fabian tactics on battlefields? He's there to engage him in battle,
Right.
and that's what takes it from that point on.
And speaking of Germantown, I mean, he had about 11,000, where Howe had about 9, and he leads the attack there. So
Yeah,
like
now and I've changed the numbers on that one, and the book brings us out. A friend and I published on this where he actually had 16,000 at
wow.
Germantown. And here's the key about Germantown. Germantown's fascinating. In fact, uh, fellow Revolutionary War historians and I got on this email stream because we just had the anniversary of the Battle of Germantown on October 4th. And then you had the surrender at Saratoga coming up, and the battle that led to that at Bemis Heights on October 7th. So October is a very big month in 1777 in American history for a lot of reasons. Now, Germantown is another loss, right? However, I hope you caught this at the end of the book, because it ends on a very positive note where we look at the Philadelphia campaign as a failure in America. They weren't looking at it that way in Europe, were they? Like at Germantown. And that's the key, is because Washington, when he attacks at Germantown, and I got to tell you, Jared, I was tempted to write it this way. I just didn't have the evidence. I am highly suspicious, but without the evidence to put it down on paper. I think Washington was thinking big picture in this attack. And when I say big picture, I think he's thinking about making a positive impression on the powers that be in France. I think he's already thinking of that. I just didn't have enough evidence to really strengthen that case. But when he attacks at Germantown, unlike most people that write about Germantown and think Washington was trying to capture Philadelphia, no evidence for that at all, because Philadelphia is never mentioned as the endpoint of his battle objective. His objective is a strong strike against the outposts that you correctly mentioned, their strength of 9,000, because Howe divided his army. Then Germantown, which is now kind of part of Philadelphia now, was a completely separate entity from Philadelphia, 6 miles north of it. And 9,000 men were in Germantown, and another 4,000 were in Philadelphia, and then another 2,000 were dispersed on the other side of the Delaware. So Washington took advantage of that fractionated army to attack the closest opponent to him, but he wanted to attack with strength. And what I found was when Washington strikes it, in Germantown, he always gets criticized for too elaborate a battle plan. You've heard that story, I bet, right?
Oh yeah.
Here he is going on fire. Well, the attack miraculously occurred from one end of the line to the other within 20 minutes of each other, once all the parties got engaged after they drove away their skirmishers. And at one point, you had 13 American brigades engaged. And each brigade's at least 1,000 officers and men, most of them a little bit more than that. I put the strength somewhere between 13,500 and 14,000 Americans attacking on a battlefield all at once. That is easily the largest tactical offensive of the American Revolution, and it won't be topped until the Battle of Shiloh, 82 years later.
Correct. Yep.
So that's Washington as an offensive tactician. And Germantown ends up being a defeat because he achieves the first goal, which was to drive to actually panic a part of the force temporarily. But the British and Hessians that were holding that town, just superlative fighting on their part, because they don't have the high ground advantage, and yet they did a superb job. They were good, well trained soldiers. They didn't completely buckle, and then they took advantage of a momentum change and turned the tables on Washington. And Washington's army's forced to retreat. They got away with all their cannons, unlike Brandywine, where they lost 11 of them. They didn't lose any at Germantown. So Washington leaves that battlefield, but it isn't that what happened to Germantown wasn't that far off of what Washington expected to do, which was attack and retreat on his own volition. He had no intention of staying. He didn't bring his supply wagons with him. He didn't give his men only had the ammunition they came with, and he made sure that those wagons didn't roll any closer than 15 miles from them. He basically was putting a check on himself not to get carried away with the battle, even if they were having that success. He wasn't going to carry that to Philadelphia. I'm convinced he was going to have to retreat because he has to feed 16,000 men, and he didn't have any supply wagons to do that, right? So what happened at the end wasn't that different from what he would have planned anyway. It's just that he was forced off the field rather than leave on his own. And he did take twice as many casualties, and that's a classic attacking force going to suffer at least twice as many casualties as a defending force. That's exactly what happened at Germantown. Nothing to sneeze at when you lose 1,100 men, but the impact, and I'm sure you remember reading that it had on the from generals down to privates was extraordinary. It really was this incredible morale booster. And what it ended up doing by December, when France is learning about it, is that they're treating it like a huge American victory, and it's going to lead to them opening negotiations with in equal billing with Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in terms of a very positive spin for the Americans to be looked at as an alliance with France.
Right. And or that battle doesn't only catch the eye of France. Prussia is also very, very much impressed by it, which says a lot because, like you said, that's the world's greatest fighting force at that time, and they're impressed by it.
Right. And as I said, I was just so tempted to take it the extra step and say that Washington attacked with the notion that he was going to try to influence the French with it. I have that still in the back of my head, but I didn't write that. I tried to be a very careful historian about this, but I was tempted because I think Washington does have that big picture in his head, and that's exactly what it ended up doing. So maybe more by happenstance. Okay, I'll admit that, but it definitely was in other words, I will consider Germantown the most beneficial defeat in American history. Easily. There is no military defeat in American history that comes close to the benefits that Germantown imparted upon America.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find one. Maybe Guilford Courthouse, but you're right.
Yeah, right. I mean, Guilford Court was helpful for that campaign, and you could also let's take. I'll even put one that's even closer than that, Bunker Hill, which is a Crown Force victory, but they lost so many men. It was a true Pyrrhic victory for them, and it did nothing but convince them that Americans are going to be a tough go to defeat in war, even though the Americans were driven away in that battle.
Right.
But Germantown, because of that extra impact on French recognition, is definitely the beneficial one.
Right. All right. Well, we've been going a while, so take us home. How does Washington end up in Valley Forge from here?
Yeah. So remember, there are the two simultaneous campaigns are Washington. Washington as the commander in chief isn't just commander in chief of the Grand Army, which is in the um, this middle department. It's just operating there, but he's in charge of it no matter where it's going to go. He's in charge of all departments. There's 7 departments, military departments in the United States at that time, and the Northern Department, which was led by Philip Schuyler and now is led by Horatio Gates, who is Washington's previous adjutant, is now in command of that department. And Washington has to really be careful about dividing up his troops and sending them up to Gates so that he has enough to counter John Burgoyne, who I brought up earlier, and is in invading force to conquer Albany, and then to link up with the British force that's already in New York under Henry Clinton. And that gets turned back largely because of the troops that Washington supplied with Gates. Washington gave Gates Benedict Arnold, who was a great American hero before he turned traitor. He gave him Daniel Morgan and the Rifle Company, which did such a stellar job in that department. So after Gates achieves his victory, Washington wants those troops back, and Gates doesn't want to give them back. So there's this middle part of my book where Washington is realizing that there's an undercurrent of criticism that's developing. He's not only got an enemy in his front that he's always had, he now has an enemy behind him. And that is a little conspiracy that's going to develop into what will be misnamed, but a true cabal, an effort to undermine Washington and usurp his power and distribute it among what's called the Board of War. And Washington gets the undercurrent of that throughout this first volume, at least the latter half of it. And part of that is because of Gates, who is supposed to he's supposed to answer to Washington. All right. And let me just give you guys a quick geometry lesson. I won't have a map of it, and I didn't have a map in the book of this. But here's Saratoga. The Continental Congress has moved from Philadelphia to York. That's this part of the triangle, right? And then Washington's over here. So it's about 350 miles to carry a dispatch from Gates to Washington directly. All right. And you go to this place called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then you take it down to Washington. Well, the courier goes from Gates to Bethlehem, but he heads all the way to York and delivers his messages to the Continental Congress, who then have to relay it to Washington. So Washington is delayed 4 days at least from getting communication directly from a subordinate that's supposed to answer to him, and instead is basically disregarding Washington and answering to the Continental Congress. So Washington's already realizing that this is going on, and there's he doesn't have the power to charge for this, because it's really important for Washington to know this, and it's tough for him to get those troops. He finally does, through a lot of prying, get 5 more brigades sent him. And I think, again, this is a picture that of troop strength, and it's really one of the things. I'm going to go on a slight tangent. I'll bring it back. Trust me. When we do Civil War history, and Jared, you'll understand this, we do count. We know that the Confederates like to talk about rank and file, and in the Union they described it as officers and men, and historians are really good at making it apples to apples comparison, right? Effective strength versus present for duty strength and all that stuff.
Right.
In Civil War history, we're really good at that, and any reader of modern Civil War books knows that a good attempt is made to correct the record to make those apples to apples comparison. In Revolutionary War writing, they haven't really caught on to that yet. And most of the time, they still use rank and file, and they don't count the officers. And it's just a mind-boggling thing. That's why, and I'll bring the point about while this comes together. So if I have any influence on Revolutionary War historiography from this point on, I hope I'm able to use my transfer from Civil War history writing to at least use the apples to apples comparison that's supposed to be made. And that is, you got to count, rank and file in Revolutionary War is is privates and corporals. I think in Civil War, it's the other non-com, sergeants and
Mhm.
corporals and privates, right? So it's not that much different, but they don't count field officers and they don't count staff officers. And as I try to explain to my Revolutionary War friends, if a sergeant goes down with a wound, or an artilleryman goes down with a wound, or a captain goes down with a wound, he's called a casualty in battle, right? Well, you got to call him present on the battlefield. You can't use rank and file numbers and then use casualty figures that go beyond the rank and file. You got to use complete numbers. That's why, at Valley Forge, you might have heard, well, there were 12,000 men encamped at Valley Forge, which is in my volume 2. No, there's 19,000 men. 19,000 men encamped there because you got to count all the numbers, right? You got to feed those guys. They
Right.
make cabins. So this is my point about getting to the end of volume 1. When Washington gets those 5 brigades, and this is gonna have an influence on British recognition down the road, is that they're impressed when they learn about Germantown that Washington hasn't retreated 50 miles from the battlefield, and they say, oh, he's got 15,000 men still in the vicinity of Germantown, or yeah, in the vicinity of Germantown, meaning ready to strike again. And back in the 1950s and 60s, historians would denigrate that claim and say, oh, it was false. It was a false belief on the French officials because Washington didn't have anything close to those numbers. And I'll agree with them. He didn't have close to those numbers. He had more than that, because by the time France is negotiating or considering negotiating with Americans in early December, Washington has 24,000 men at White Marsh, just 16 miles from Philadelphia. And to know what 24,000 officers and men is, that would make the hilly area of White Marsh, 16 miles north of Philadelphia, larger than the civilian population of New York City in 1777. In other words, the second largest population center in the country.
Wow.
And Washington doesn't collect 17 brigades and 24,000 men to have them sitting 16 miles north of Philadelphia because he plans to go to a winter encampment with them. He wants to attack Philadelphia. He's on that constant attack mode. So that's how the book ends, kind of on that, it ends with the Battle of White Marsh where Washington's ready to attack Philadelphia, but Howe takes it to Washington first. And it ends kind of in the aftermath of that, and then the French discussing with the American officials, the diplomats like Benjamin Franklin and Dean and Lee in Paris about all this. But it shows that Washington is really working at trying to find the best way to attack Philadelphia, which is going to open volume 2 when he plans a big attack on Philadelphia from Valley Forge.
So to wrap this up, 2 quick questions for you. The first is, if people want to go visit these sites today that you have in volume 1, what is there left to visit of it? I know that there's the battlefield at Brandywine, but what are some sites that the folks can see, especially as they're starting to travel for the 250th?
Well, the good news is that there's more of it is open, much like some Civil War battlefields in certain areas like the Shenandoah Valley. More of it is open to the public than was 50 years ago. That's the good news, right? The bad news is that you got to have a little inside information to know how to get to those places. So the number one thing I'd recommend is that you join our Beegis tour in July of 2025 and join Michael Harris and I for our first 2-part series on the Philadelphia campaign. But we'll get you off the beaten path on the hidden sites. But there's enough open land sites like the Brandywine battlefield is a state park with more open ground on it than has ever been available before, and a lot of it is in really good condition. A lot of good, and with period houses throughout. Germantown, is pretty much encompassed by the community of Germantown. There's not much of that battlefield left. But the main area where the battle was fought was called the Chew House or Cliveden, and it's open to the public with its yards, and it looks much like it did in 1777. And actually, as you read in the book, that was Washington's one of Washington's first battlefield tours. He visited
Mhm.
Cliveden 1 month after the battle for a different reason, but got to look at the battlefield that he probably couldn't see very well on the day of the battle because it was so foggy. But he got to visit that battlefield because it was only 5 miles from his headquarters at the time. White Marsh is parts of it are very pristine condition, which is another battle. The Battle of Paoli, which I only briefly touch on, is there, but I talk about Washington routes of march to the furnaces and over some fords over the Schuylkill. All of that's in great condition. So much more of that is more interpretable, if I could use that word, than you could imagine. Even though much of that is not national park ground, a lot of it is preserved by local and state sites to be able to visit. Lots of Washington's headquarters are still standing. Some of them are private homes, but a lot of them are open to the public as well, at least to the outside, with visits to the inside by appointment. So it's a wonderful experience to get caught up in the Philadelphia campaign and then just in general any Revolutionary War history sites. And so as we approach the 250th, I highly recommend that you make the leap and start learning about the Revolution. Ken Burns' series, I think it's a 5-part series. It's going to come out in about a year. I think November of 25 it'll be released. I don't think it's going to have the same impact as the Civil War series, but I think it'll be a very beneficial impact to have that released as well. So a lot of good things are going to be happening during this upcoming 250th anniversary.
Right. And thank you for plugging your upcoming tour for me. So
Yeah, I'm a
it
tour hawk.
yeah, if you want to go walk these battlefields and see these sites with Gary, you can have that opportunity through Blue and Gray. So we will be posting stuff about that as time gets closer. But be sure to check out our website for that coming up. And
Yeah,
the last
that tour ad is written and it should be posted soon. Yeah, so
right.
you'll be have that opportunity.
And last question is, we loved volume one. When can we expect volume two?
Well, still writing it. I'm a little inside information. I think I'm a little over 2/3 of the way done with it. It'll get done. Now that I'm writing full time. Um, I have one more blue gray tour to go this fall, coming up in a couple weeks, which is the only thing that's gonna nicely give me a little break from that writing and get back to some Civil War history. But for the most part, I'll be immersed in the Revolution, finishing that volume. My publisher is Westholme. They're wonderful. The owner is Bruce Franklin, who is a direct descendant of Benjamin Franklin's sister. So it brings a little revolution to that. And you could see he does a great job with the images and mapping and the editing of that book. It's a great publisher, and they turn around the books fairly quick. So I think my last volume one was in right around New Year's and came out in June. I think volume two's slated for a spring release. So I think it'll be late spring, more like May and June again. So expected about the same time as volume one, but a year later, which is appropriate.
Right.
And the volumes are made, if I can add, it's best to get them as a set. And as I say, I like the books, but you'd be opening them and closing them so much, the bindings might get a little bent up. You might want to buy 3 copies of each one. It's just a recommendation. Just a thought.
Yeah, yeah.
but I'm saying you don't need to buy it as a set right away. You could just buy, and it was intentional. There was an intention to to do this in 2 volumes because it's a whole different writing. The volume 2 is 6 months of an encampment of Valley Forge, followed by a real intense study of the Monmouth campaign. Whereas volume 1 was just this frenetically paced Philadelphia campaign that took you everywhere back and forth. So it's got a whole different pacing to it in volume 2. That's why I wanted it to be a separate book. But they're made to be volume 1 and volume 2, one story following right after the other, but they're independent of each other too. So if you are more interested in Valley Forge, you don't have to have read volume 1 to get to read that book, and vice versa. If you don't have to get to read volume 2 if you were more interested in the Philadelphia campaign. Hopefully the interest in one follows the interest to the other, and you end up getting both. But my point is that they're made as separate volumes to be independent reads. They don't have to be purchased or read together. Although that would be the overall intent when both volumes are available at the same time.
Well, thank you so much for coming on tonight,
Well,
Gary.
thank
We
you.
we we can't wait to have you back on when volume two comes out, so we can finish the story of Washington's momentous year. We will have a link in our description below where you can purchase the book on through Amazon.
Right,
I
that's fine.
think I think as of the recording of this, there's actually a sale on the book, so you can get it even cheaper than normal. But be sure to buy that and support Gary and come out and see him on either a Civil War tour, or you'll have to wait till
Right.
next year for his Rev War tour. But come out and support him, say hello, and like I said, thank you so much for spending some time talking about this great book.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak about it. I always like to talk about Washington and the Revolution, and thanks for accommodating me, having me aboard, and thanks everybody for listening.